So we're going to take a real quick look at bias as it shows up in psychology studies, and then the ethics that surround kind of the study of psychology and study of science in general. Taking a look at these two things very quickly, not super in-depth. There's not a whole lot of detail we really need to get into here. So we'll talk about bias first, and bias it's never a good thing. You want to avoid bias at all costs. Bias is kind of slanting or tilting your research in one direction that is not always, well, it's never productive. It's never good. You want to make sure you can eliminate bias. And a couple ways to do that is first is finding a way to make your survey or experiment easily replicated. So, and replication is an important process where you can repeat the survey or the experiment multiple times over, maybe occasionally changing the sample size or a variable here or there, but keeping basically the same idea and testing for the same correlation or the same causation. And repeat performances makes your results more certain. If you're getting the same result on 12 different surveys or 12 different experiments in a row, then it's more likely to be correct than if you just do it the first time. Because as much as we try to make things as scientific and mathematically pure as possible, sometimes things do happen due to chance. So replication is a really important process in the scientific field in general, but also in psychology. We can never say for sure, certain because of one survey or one experiment that we have thing. We need replication. Another way to look at to avoid bias is through a meta-analysis, and this is where you take a large number of surveys over a large number of years and things that have evaluated the same variables and see if you can form a big picture view and get a bigger understanding of what's going on there. An example, I use a meta-analysis of educational practices in order to form my teaching style. So I look at effective teaching and studies that have been conducted over the last 20 or 30 years. A guy has published that in a meta-analysis, and so I can then see from a big picture, okay, what works versus what doesn't. And so that allows us to kind of see more holistically what's happening. So those are two really good ways to avoid potential bias. And we'll start looking at some of the biases that do exist. And perhaps the most dangerous one is the sampling bias. Your goal whenever you're choosing a sample population to study is to get a sample that really represents your population. So if you have 50% female and 50% male population, your sample size should include 50% males and 50% females. And same breakdown by ethnicity, by sexual orientation, by whatever it may be. You want kind of a good representative sample. And sampling bias occurs when the sample does not match up to the population as a whole. And that attack has dogged psychology for a while now, especially with the rise of cultural psychology. Because most psychology has been done in the United States, and so it's become very American-centric. And those that haven't been done in the United States, a huge percentage of those have been done in places like Western Europe, who are very similar to the United States in their kind of white liberal, classic liberalism views. And so it's important that we start to shift away from that. The other thing is in the United States, a majority of samples tend to skew towards having more white people than is representative of the whole population. So sampling bias is very much a real thing and very much problematic and something we want to avoid. Another concern that experimenters might find is something known as the placebo effect. So the placebo effect is when participants expect to experience something, and so they kind of mentally convince themselves that that's going to happen. And if you're self-reporting, then they're saying, oh yeah, I felt that, I felt so much better, I felt this, I felt that, when in reality they're just experiencing a placebo effect. And just solely believing something, that you're getting a drug or a treatment that's going to make you better, or that this is a negative attitude, can really affect your perception and your experience of an event. And so it's really important to do whatever we can to negate the placebo effect or just be aware of it. And one way to do that is to have kind of like 3 different groups: a control group, a fake experimental group, and then an experimental group. And this can kind of help us see, like, okay, how much did the placebo effect of thinking they're getting treatment help push these healing or whatever it is you want to call it. So having this fake experimental treatment can help to offset the bias of placebo effect and the bias of those people feeling like they're getting help when maybe they aren't. A couple of other biases that we'll look at. Some that are participant-based is one thing called the social desirability bias. And this occurs when people want their answers to be seen as socially acceptable. And the classic example of this is racial beliefs and kind of racial attitudes. And no one ever wants to be viewed as a racist, but the reality is that racists exist, and they exist in large numbers. And so they change their answers to be seen as socially acceptable rather than expressing their true deep down feelings. And that's problematic. That's a problem with self-report data. And one way to easily tell if someone is falling into the social desirability bias is if you're interviewing them, if they take a while to answer the question, it really means they're doing a lot of thinking and processing to try to see if what they're saying is going to be considered acceptable by various norms. So be careful of social desirability bias. That shows up on controversial issues very often because people don't want to be seen as being on the wrong side of history or being seen as being wrong or unethical or immoral or something like that. They want to be seen as being right and okay and good and those sorts of things. The other thing is the halo effect. And so the halo effect is when you have an overall feeling towards someone or hold value towards someone or something that affects specific ratings. So, for example, you may have a teacher who you really like as a person, but is not an effective teacher. So you may like them as a person, but not as a teacher. But because you like them, when you're given an end of the year course survey of how good was the teaching in this class, you may give them an 8 or a 9 instead of the 5 or 6 that they deserve because you like them. That's that idea of the halo effect. Think of it as this kind of like ring of goodness that surrounds people or institutions that really clouds our vision and prevents us from seeing the truth or at least acknowledging the truth. Another big thing is experimenter bias, and that occurs when researchers have an expectation for what their survey or study or example will turn up or experiment will turn up, and those expectations affecting the outcome. So that could be in terms of the way they word questions, it could be a way that terms that they group people, or the way they interpret statistics or specific responses. And so research bias experimenter bias is really problematic. And the easiest way to solve this is run what we call a double-blind study. We've talked about this before, where neither the researcher nor the experimental or control groups knows who is getting the experiment and who's getting the control. And so this requires obviously a third party, a neutral outside influencer to kind of come in and make sure that everything's on the up and up. So that's kind of ways that bias shows up, and then a few ways that we can work to counter bias, because we never want to see bias existing in our work. Okay, so let's talk about some ethics around psychology. And there wasn't really kind of any feelings towards this or any standards or any concern or thought at all about ethics in psychology until Stanley Milgram in his experiment, and that was the obedience to authority, the one where someone believed that they were electrocuting a learner who was not learning properly, kind of a way of looking at behaviors. Okay, and this experiment so kind of shocked the psychology community, and people were so offended, and it was so divisive, that there was this real push for a standardized practice and a standard of acceptable kind of behavior of psychologists as it related to their participants. And so along came the American Psychological Association, the APA, and they created standards and said this is what it should look like, this is how you should conduct yourself, this is how you should kind of relate to participants. And so that really was the first initial step, and it was followed up to have like another layer of defense to ensure that everything was on the up and up and that everything was staying on the right side of the moral line. A lot of universities create what are known as institutional review boards, and that is kind of a group of generally their older professors or psychologists who are on staff who evaluate every research project and proposal before it gets going to make sure that it is in fact ethical, that it's not crossing any lines. And so that's to keep their name good, that's to keep themselves legally protected, but it's also really helped to kind of form a better opinion and a better perception of psychology as a whole. So some of the standards that are expected of researchers as they interact with participants is that first, participants have to give informed consent. So they have to know what is going to happen to them before they agree to participate in the study. And that's really, really crucial, that they have to be fully aware of what's going to happen in this study before they participate. And they have to be given the opportunity to leave the experiment if they feel uncomfortable. And you can imagine, knowing what Milgram's experiment was like, why these rules kind of came into place, and how it's tough to be able to understand the depth of human capability for evil if we had these safeguards in place. Another thing that's important for this APA is that participants after the experiment have to receive a debrief. So they have to be told why the experiment happened and be told of any deception that they came under, so that they're not walking away feeling a sense of guilt or remorse or like they did something wrong, but that they can actually leave with a clean conscience. So the idea is to protect all parties, the researcher as well as the participants, from trauma, from lawsuits, from anything like that. Another thing that's becoming more and more important in psychology is confidentiality of researchers, and then when you get into clinical psychology, of your patients. This is super important. We can't be spreading, there's a lot of private information that's accessed through these surveys and through questionnaires, and it's really important that that stuff stays confidential. Otherwise, it can be very damaging to individuals, to their relationships, to their jobs, things of that sort. So confidentiality is an important thing to keep in place. And it's something to keep in mind as we move forward. And then the last bit that's kind of continuing to show its face and be in the limelight of discussion is the role of animal research in science and in psychology. There's kind of two sides of the coin here. There's one side that argues that it provides life-saving drugs. Using animal research provides life-saving drugs, and saving the lives of humans is important. And the other side says that animals endure too much psychological and physiological stress as they go through these experiments and through this research. And so both sides may be right. It just depends on who you are as to where you fall. And this is an ongoing debate. And as technology continues to advance, it seems like it may be able to replace the need for animal research. Now, we're still a ways off from that, but there seem to be breakthroughs that are coming through that can replace that need. So these ethics questions are constantly changing as we move, as the world around us changes, as culture changes, as research changes, as different subjects in psychology change. So it's really important to recognize that ethics are they exist for a reason, to protect us, but what is ethical and what is the main conversation driving psychological ethics is always changing.